My son, the very man I raised and loved, was trying to murder me, slowly poisoning my tea in my own home. He and his wife called it caring for me, but all they did was isolate me and wait for me to die just so they could cash in my life insurance policy. They thought I was just a weak, confused old woman who wouldn't notice, but they had no idea I was planning the perfect revenge. And I decided to serve it to them at their lavish anniversary party, right in front of all their rich and powerful friends. The guests loved the house. They always did. From my corner chair, the one Daniel and Melissa called Mom's Command Center, I watched them admire the original crown molding and the tasteful minimalist furniture that had replaced the comfortable clutter my husband and I had spent 50 years accumulating. This house, a classic Queen Anne craftsman that Robert and I bought when it was just a dream and a pile of sawdust, was now their showroom. Daniel was holding court, a glass of expensive Pinot Noir swirling in his hand. He was talking about ethical sourcing for his tech startup, his voice resonating with a passion that felt rehearsed. His wife Melissa nodded along, her hand resting on his arm. They were a perfect picture of Seattle success, progressive, conscientious, and beautifully curated. The couple they were hosting, some venture capitalist, and his wife were eating it up. Every few minutes, Melissa would glide over to me. She'd adjust the cashmere blanket on my lap, even though I wasn't cold, or lower her voice to ask if I was comfortable. Daniel would then glance over and smile, a public display of the devoted son. He told their guests how it was their honor to care for me here in my own home, especially after my heart surgery. He spoke of my fragile state, my good days and bad days, all while I sat 10 feet away listening. They talked about me like I was a piece of antique furniture they were dutifully preserving. I just smiled faintly and played my part, the frail matriarch. In this city, a city of polite surfaces, no one ever looks too closely. No one ever pries. They see a loving family caring for their aging mother, and the story ends there. After the guests left, the performance didn't stop. It just changed its script. The next few days became a quiet campaign of kindness, a suffocating blanket of concern. My meals were managed for perfect nutrition, which meant bland, soupy things I had no appetite for. My old friends would call, but Melissa would answer my phone, explaining in a gentle, regretful tone that I was resting and couldn't be disturbed. A neighbor who used to pop by with flowers was told I wasn't up for visitors to conserve my energy. My world, which had once been the entire city, was shrinking to the four walls of this house. Every afternoon, Daniel would prepare a special herbal tea for me. He said it was a blend to help with my heart, something a naturopath had recommended. He'd bring it to me in my favorite porcelain cup, his face a mask of loving care. But the tea had a strange taste, a faint metallic bitterness that clung to the back of my throat. And with each cup, a fog would roll in a heavy weakness that made my limbs feel like lead. I'd try to read, but the words would swim on the page. I'd drift into a shallow, unrestful sleep. Daniel would dismiss my complaints as part of my recovery. "It's just your body healing, Mom," he'd say, patting my hand. "You have to be patient." One afternoon, when the fog was particularly thick, he came to me with a sheaf of papers and a cheerful smile. He sat on the ottoman at my feet, spreading the documents on my lap. He told me he'd been looking at my insurance policies and that they were a mess, old and complicated. He said he could consolidate them, get me better rates. It would save the estate so much trouble later on. He explained, his voice so reasonable, so patient. He just needed my signature on a few forms to let him talk to the companies on my behalf. I looked at the pages, but the dense legal text blurred together. I felt too tired to argue, too weary to read the fine print. A small, distant alarm bell was ringing in my mind, but the metallic haze from the tea was too loud. It was easier to just agree. I took the pen he offered my hand, feeling clumsy and slow, and I signed where he pointed. I watched him gather the pages, neatly tapping them into a tidy stack, a little smile of satisfaction on his face. He didn't know I saw the pages he slipped into the middle of the stack, the ones with bold headings like durable power of attorney and asset management transfer. Or maybe he knew and just didn't think I was lucid enough to understand. That night I couldn't sleep. The fog had lifted, replaced by a restless, anxious energy. My heart was pounding a strange, irregular rhythm. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up and shuffled to the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was silent dark, except for the moonlight filtering through the large windows. As I filled my glass at the sink, my eyes fell on the recycling bin, and there, sitting on top of a pile of discarded mail, was a small white and green pharmacy box. It wasn't one of my prescriptions. I knew all of mine by heart. My hands trembled slightly as I reached in and pulled it out. The label was stark under the dim kitchen light. The name on it was digoxin, a powerful cardiac drug. I had been a nurse for 40 years. I knew exactly what it was for. And I knew with a certainty that turned my blood to ice that my doctor had never prescribed it for me. I stood there for a long moment, the cold box clutched in my hand, the chilled glass of water forgotten, the metallic aftertaste in my memory, the creeping weakness, the fog. It all clicked into place with the sickening finality of a lock snapping shut. I slipped the box into the pocket of my robe. The aftertaste in the tea wasn't a side effect. It was the main ingredient. It wasn't a prison of concern they were building. It was a tomb. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now let's get back to it. The fear didn't go away. It settled deep in my bones, a cold, permanent guest. But something else woke up that night too. The part of me that had raised a child alone after Robert died. The part that had managed a chaotic emergency room for 20 years. The part that knew how to think clearly when the world was on fire. The fog of the past few weeks burned away, leaving behind a terrifying, sharp-edged clarity. They thought I was a frail old woman. Fine. I would be the frailest, most confused old woman they had ever seen. My new life began the next morning. When Daniel brought me my tea, I smiled my weak, grateful smile. He watched as I raised the porcelain cup to my lips, his eyes full of that practiced concern. I let the warm rim touch my mouth and made a small sipping sound. The moment he turned to the kitchen counter, I leaned over as if to admire the large potted fern by my chair and tipped the contents of the cup into the soil. I hoped ferns didn't mind a bit of digoxin. When he turned back, I was dabbing my lips with a napkin. I told him it was lovely, but perhaps a little strong today. That was the start of my new ritual. Every day was a performance. I started a journal not with words, but with symbols only I could understand. A small circle for the time the tea arrived. A wavy line if I felt dizzy after a meal. A sharp X next to a date if Daniel had a hushed, intense phone call. It was a tiny notebook I kept tucked inside a book of poetry on my nightstand. To them, I was just a woman, fading away, a problem being managed. To me, I was a detective, and my own life was the case I had to solve. I leaned into the part, sometimes asking what day it was, sometimes pretending to forget a name. Their underestimation of me was the only shield I had, and I held it tight. After a week of this silent observation, I decided it was time to rattle the cage. I waited for the perfect moment, lunchtime. We were all sitting at the table, a picture of domestic tranquility. Melissa was talking about a charity auction, and Daniel was nodding along. I waited for a lull in the conversation, then looked at Melissa, letting my expression go blank, and a little puzzled, the way I'd seen so many of my former patients do. I told her, my voice thin and reedy, that I had the strangest thought. I said I'd found the oddest little box in the trash the other night. It had a long, funny name, digoxin. I think I asked if Dr. Evans had prescribed that for me. I couldn't seem to recall. The effect was immediate and glorious. Melissa's fork clattered onto her plate. All the color drained from her face. Her eyes darted to Daniel wide with pure panic. She stammered, telling me, oh, that must have been some old medication of hers from years and years ago. She'd just been cleaning out the medicine cabinet, she said, her voice a little too high. She was a terrible liar. Daniel, on the other hand, was smoother. Later that day, after he'd clearly had time to coach his wife, he came to me. He knelt by my chair, taking my hand. He told me he'd heard I was worried about that medicine box. He explained, his voice like warm honey, that it was just a free sample the pharmacy had given him for his own heart palpitations. He was so sorry for the confusion. He should have thrown it in the main trash. He assured me it wasn't for me at all. I just nodded, pretending to be relieved. But inside, a grim satisfaction settled in. Her story and his story didn't match. It wasn't just a conspiracy. It was a clumsy one. Their panic gave me an idea. I knew I needed to reach the outside world, and now that they were spooked, it would be harder than ever. So I used the one thing they couldn't deny me without looking like monsters, their daughter. I told Daniel that I was feeling lonely and that I desperately missed my granddaughter Lily. I asked if we could please have a little video call. He exchanged a look with Melissa, but he couldn't refuse. He brought me his tablet, already logged in. Lily's bright 10-year-old face filled the screen, and for a moment, my heart ached with real love. We talked for a few minutes about her school and her friends. Then I put my plan into motion. I started to cough, a dry, racking sound. I pressed a hand to my chest, telling Lily I was feeling a bit faint. I asked her in a weak voice if she could please go get her daddy for me. The second her face disappeared from the screen, my fingers flew. I swiped the call away and hit my recent contacts. My oldest friend, Carol, a retired nurse with a mind like a steel trap. It rang once, twice. She picked up. I didn't waste a second. I spoke in a fast, low whisper. I told her I was fine, but I had a quick question. I asked her what digoxin does in high doses to someone with my specific heart condition. The silence on the other end of the line was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It stretched for 3, maybe 4 seconds. Then Carol's voice, tight with alarm, said my name. Nora. She asked, "Where are you?" Before I could answer, the tablet was snatched from my hands. Daniel stood over me, his face a thundercloud. The friendly sun was gone, replaced by a cold, angry stranger. He ended the call, his thumb jabbing at the screen. He told me that was enough excitement for one day. He said that for my own health, to ensure I get proper rest, he and Melissa would be holding onto my phone and the tablet from now on. The gilded cage had slammed shut, and now it was a true prison. They thought they had contained the problem. They had no idea they had just cornered an animal with nothing left to lose. The first rule of survival is to adapt. After Daniel took the tablet, the house fell silent in a new and terrible way. My brief connection to the outside world was severed. I was truly alone, so I leaned into the role they had written for me. My decline, which had been a subtle act, became a full-blown performance. I seemed to get weaker, more forgetful. I'd drift off mid-sentence or stare blankly at the television, my mind seemingly miles away. And it worked. Daniel and Melissa relaxed. Their caution softened into a casual cruelty, an arrogant confidence that the final obstacle in their path was crumbling to dust. They started discussing things more openly in front of me, using vague terms, but with an urgency I could feel. They talked about deadlines and appearances, about one last big event that had to go perfectly. They were convinced my earlier suspicion had been a final, fleeting spark of a mind that was now extinguished. But in the quiet of my room, I was getting stronger. I stopped eating their food entirely, claiming I had no appetite, that my stomach was too delicate. They'd leave trays outside my door, which I would later scrape into a bag, hidden in my closet. I survived on the secret stash I'd built over the years: sealed packs of crackers, small tins of nuts, and bottled water I'd squirreled away for a rainy day. I never imagined the storm would be in my own house. While they watched me fade, I was slowly, secretly nourishing myself back to life. Chachor. In the dark stillness of their bedroom, lit only by the cold blue glow of a laptop screen, the reason for their cruelty was laid bare. At 3 in the morning, sleep was a luxury Daniel and Melissa could not afford. On the screen was a final demand letter, its legal language sharp and merciless. Their revolutionary green tech startup, the one that was supposed to disrupt the industry, had been a house of cards. It had collapsed, leaving them personally liable for millions in venture capital loans. They had been hiding it for months, funding their lavish lifestyle with high-interest credit cards, projecting an image of success while privately drowning. Melissa was crying, her sobs muffled in a silk pillow. She told Daniel they were going to lose everything: the house, their friends, their entire lives. They would be pariahs in the Seattle tech world, a fate worse than poverty. Daniel's face was a taut mask of fury and desperation. He whispered fiercely that their upcoming 20th anniversary party was their last chance. It was a performance, a way to project confidence and stability to the very people who held their future in their hands. They just had to hold on. They just had to hold out until they got his mother's life insurance payout. It was their only real way out. I knew nothing of their desperate late-night conversations. I only knew that the son I had raised was trying to kill me. In the long, silent hours I spent alone in my room, my mind sifted through memories, searching for a tool, a weapon, anything. And then I remembered Robert. My late husband had been a quiet, methodical man. Years ago, he had given me a small, ornate brass key. He'd told me it was for the most important family records, a final safety net. I had forgotten all about it. My heart hammering, I slid out of bed and went to the old framed photograph on my dresser, a picture of Robert and me on our wedding day. I turned it over, and there, held by a yellowed piece of tape, was the key. It was just as I remembered it. The room was cold, but the key felt warm in my hand, a final gift from the man I loved. I knew where the lock was. In the back of my closet, beneath a loose floorboard Robert had shown me once and told me to never forget. This was it. This was the safety net. Later that evening, as I was pretending to doze in my armchair, Daniel took a phone call in the hallway just outside my open door. He must have thought I was asleep, or perhaps so far gone that his words would be meaningless sounds. His voice was dripping with an arrogance I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. He was speaking to a caterer, finalizing details for their party. He said it had to be perfect, that it wasn't just a party, it was a statement. He told the person on the phone that everyone who matters will be there. He said they were about to turn a corner and that his mother, bless her, was the key to their entire future. He had no idea that I was on the other side of the door, wide awake. I was not the key to his future. But in my hand, hidden in the folds of my robe, I was holding the key to his past, and it was about to unlock everything. The waiting was the hardest part. Days turned into a week. My frantic, broken call to Carol felt like a lifetime ago. I had no way of knowing if she'd understood the danger or if she'd dismissed it as the ramblings of a sick old woman. My hope began to fray. I continued my performance a ghost in my own home while Daniel and Melissa buzzed with preparations for their party. They were cheerful, energized like actors preparing for a grand opening night. They didn't know I was preparing too. Then one afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was a cheerful, insistent sound that made Melissa sigh with annoyance. I heard her open the door, her voice tight with forced politeness. And then I heard a voice I thought I might never hear again. It was Carol, bright, booming, and impossible to ignore. I shuffled to the living room, leaning heavily on my walker just in time to see her step into the foyer. She was holding an enormous gift basket, overflowing with flowers, magazines, and containers of what smelled like chicken soup. She beamed at Melissa, telling her how terribly worried she'd been after our call got cut short. She just had to pop by to make sure I was all right. It was a masterclass in social strategy. Here, in the polite world of Queen Anne, you do not turn away a friend bearing soup. It would be an unforgivable breach of etiquette. Melissa was trapped. Through gritted teeth, she smiled and invited Carol in for a few minutes. Carol swept into the room and came right to me, fussing over my blanket and telling me I looked too pale. It was all a beautiful performance. While Melissa went to the kitchen to put the flowers in water, Carol's hand brushed mine, and I felt something small and cold press into my palm. A tiny glass vial. At the same moment, Melissa's phone rang. Her voice from the kitchen became sharp, annoyed. It was a problem with the party invitations. I knew this was our only chance. Carol gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. I pushed myself up slowly, telling her I'd be honored to get her a glass of water. My journey to the kitchen was the longest walk of my life. My heart hammered against my ribs. Daniel had just prepared my afternoon tea. The porcelain cup was sitting on the counter, a faint steam rising from its surface. With my back to the hallway, my hands trembling so hard, I thought I'd drop everything. I uncapped the vial and dipped it into the tea, drawing up a small sample. Then I filled a glass with water and turned around. Melissa was still on the phone, pacing and frustrated. Back in the living room, I handed the water to Carol. As she took it, our hands met again, and I passed the full vial back to her. I then looked toward my bedroom and told her that Robert had left some old photo albums in my closet, and I would love for her to have one. She understood immediately. While I distracted Melissa by asking for a sweater, Carol slipped into my bedroom. She was in there for no more than 30 seconds. When she emerged, she placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. Her large purse looked slightly fuller than before. Melissa finally got off the phone, her patience clearly gone. Carol said her goodbyes, promising to call again soon, a promise we both knew she couldn't keep. And then she was gone. The small prepaid phone she'd slipped me along with the vial felt heavy and dangerous in my pocket. I waited until I was sure they were asleep, then locked my bedroom door and dialed her number. She answered on the first ring. She told me she was in her kitchen with the contents of the lockbox spread out on the table. I asked her what was inside. I was expecting stock certificates, maybe the deed to a property I'd forgotten, some financial weapon Robert had left for me. But Carol was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, laced with disbelief. She told me there were no financial documents. There was just a yellowed envelope. Inside it, she said, were a few old letters and an official sealed birth certificate from 1979. The mother's name was Eleanor Vance, my best friend from childhood. The father was listed as unknown. And then she read the name of the baby, Daniel. The world tilted. Eleanor had died in a car crash when her son was just an infant. A promise made on a deathbed. A secret kept for 45 years to protect a boy from the pain of his past. My husband's handwriting was on a letter tucked alongside it, explaining everything. The adoption, the legal papers, their decision to raise him as their own, to give him their name, their home, their love. To give him a life he would have never known. The son I called my own was never mine by blood. He was a sacred trust, and his entire life, the very ground he stood on, was a gift from the woman he was now slowly, methodically trying to murder. On the other end of the phone, there was only silence. I finally found my voice, but it was a whisper, a ragged thread of sound. I told her he doesn't know. He thinks he's betraying his mother, but he's betraying a sacred promise made to a ghost. In that moment, the power in the universe shifted. The grief was immense, a tidal wave of sorrow for the friend I had lost and the son I had failed. But beneath the grief was something else, a foundation of cold, hard steel. I was no longer just a victim fighting for my life. I was the guardian of a truth more powerful than any poison. I had the tea sample. I had my journal. And now I had his entire history in my hands. I took a deep breath, and the woman who had been weeping just a moment before was gone. I told Carol that the anniversary party was in 1 week. I told her I would need her there, and I would need a lawyer. The week leading up to the party was the calm before the storm. On the secret phone, Carol the lawyer and I finalized our plan. Every detail was sharpened to a lethal point. My coded journal, the lab results, confirming toxic levels of digoxin in the tea, and a certified copy of Daniel's original birth certificate were all in the lawyer's possession. My part was the most difficult. I had to do nothing. I had to continue being the fading, docile woman in the corner. I ate my crackers, drank my bottled water, and waited for the day of my son's 20th anniversary. The day of his public reckoning. The night of the party, the house was transformed. It pulsed with music, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. It was a masterpiece of social theater, filled with the most influential people in Seattle's tech scene. Venture capitalists whose names were whispered in awe, founders of billion-dollar companies, all mingling in my living room. Daniel and Melissa were radiant, moving through the crowd with the easy grace of a king and queen in their court. They were the perfect picture of success, of a loving partnership, of a life beautifully lived. From my designated chair, I watched them soak in the admiration, completely unaware that their entire world was about to be reduced to ashes. At the peak of the evening, Daniel stepped up to a small microphone, Melissa's hand in his. The room fell silent. His voice was smooth, confident, and filled with a warmth that made my stomach turn. He spoke of their 20-year journey together, of innovation, of community. And then he turned his attention to me. He spoke of legacy, of family, and the profound importance of caring for our elders. He raised his glass, his eyes finding mine across the room. He wanted to thank his wonderful mother, Nora, he said, for her unending support. Her sacrifices, he told the captivated audience, had made all of this possible. A wave of polite applause rippled through the room. All eyes turned to me, expecting a frail, perhaps slightly tearful wave in return. This was my cue. Supported by Carol, who had arrived as my guest, I slowly got to my feet. I was not leaning on a walker. My hands were not trembling. I felt a strength I hadn't felt in years, a cold, clear purpose that steadied my every nerve. A well-dressed man with sharp eyes, my new lawyer, stood discreetly near the edge of the room. I walked toward the microphone Daniel was still holding. A hush fell over the crowd. This was not in the script. I took the microphone from my son's unresisting hand. I thanked him, my voice clear and steady, amplified throughout the silent house. I told him that he spoke of sacrifice, and that I'd like to tell a story about a promise I made to my dearest friend Eleanor on her deathbed. I had their complete attention. I told them the story of a vibrant young woman, my best friend, whose life was cut short in a tragic car accident. I spoke of her last wish, that I raise her infant son as my own, to protect him and love him as if he were my own flesh and blood. Then I reached into my clutch and pulled out a folded document. I held it up. I told them this was her son's original birth certificate. I looked directly into Daniel's stunned, uncomprehending face. I told him that she had named him Daniel. I had just added my last name to it. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Melissa's hand flew to her mouth. The foundation of Daniel's identity, the very story of his life, cracked apart in front of his peers, his investors, his entire world. But I didn't give him a moment to process it. Before he could react, my voice rose, gaining a power that came from decades of silenced truth. I told them that the son I raised was a gift of sacred trust, but recently he had been giving me a gift in return, a special ingredient in my tea to help me rest. The word rest hung in the air, cold and menacing. I reached into my clutch a second time and pulled out another document. I held it up for all to see. It was the official lab report from the tea sample. I told them it showed toxic, near-lethal levels of digoxin, a drug that would have made my already weak heart simply stop. He had called it care. I called it attempted murder. My lawyer stepped forward, his expression grim. The room erupted. It wasn't just noise. It was the sound of a world shattering. Guests were physically backing away from Daniel and Melissa as if they were carriers of a deadly plague. The polite smiles were gone, replaced by expressions of horror and disgust. In a single catastrophic moment, their carefully constructed public persona, their careers and their freedom, disintegrated. They stood alone in the center of the room, exposed, condemned, and utterly destroyed by a truth they never thought would see the light of day. There's a strange silence that follows a storm. After the shouting and the gasps, after the frantic exodus of guests, the house was left in a state of suspended chaos. Half-eaten plates of expensive food sat on tables, next to overturned glasses of champagne. The beautiful music was gone, replaced by the quiet, rhythmic flashing of red and blue lights painting the walls. My lawyer had called the police as soon as I finished speaking. I sat in my old armchair, the one they had designated as my gilded cage, and watched the end of their world unfold. I felt no triumph, no surge of victory, just a profound, aching sadness. Daniel was pale and silent, his eyes completely vacant as an officer led him away. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. Melissa was the opposite. She was hysterical, trying to explain to Bargain to perform one last time for an audience that was no longer listening. She told an impassive officer that it was all a misunderstanding, that I was a confused, vindictive old woman. But the evidence, my lawyer's calm presentation of the facts, told a different story. Her carefully constructed world had shattered, and she couldn't comprehend it. A few months later, the dust had begun to settle, revealing the permanent new landscape of our lives. The legal process was moving forward. With the lab report, my journal, and the testimony of several party guests. The case against Daniel was overwhelming. He was charged, his name and face splashed across the local news. The stories didn't just mention the attempted murder, they detailed the collapse of his fraudulent company. He had lost everything: his reputation, his wife, his freedom, and the very identity he'd believed was his. I heard from the lawyer that he was a broken man, finally forced to confront the truth of his actions and his origins in the harsh quiet of a jail cell. Melissa, ever the survivor, cut her losses. She filed for divorce immediately, painting herself as another victim of Daniel's lies. She took Lily and disappeared from Seattle, unable to withstand the social fallout. I knew she would land on her feet somewhere else, reinvent herself, and craft a new narrative. I hoped for Lily's sake that it would be a better one. The house was mine again. Carol and a few other old friends helped me cleanse it of Daniel and Melissa's minimalist, soulless decor. We brought my old, comfortable furniture back from storage. We filled the rooms with photos, with books, with life. The house could breathe again, and so could I. I reconnected with my neighbors who were full of apologies for not noticing something was wrong. I told them there was nothing to forgive. A perfect facade is designed to be impenetrable. My first order of business was to meet with my lawyer. We took the assets that Daniel had tried to steal and placed them in an ironclad trust. Not for me, but for Lily. Her future would be secure, protected from the wreckage of her parents' lives. My legacy would not be one of wealth, but of safety and truth, a gift she would one day understand. I had kept my promise to Eleanor not just by raising her son, but by surviving him. The final scene of this long, painful story took place not in a courtroom or a lawyer's office, but in my garden. It was a sunny Seattle afternoon, and Lily was visiting. Melissa had agreed to it, perhaps out of some last flicker of decency, or perhaps just to keep a line open to the trust fund. I didn't care about her reasons. I was just happy to have my granddaughter with me. She was helping me plant new herbs, her small hands carefully patting the soil around a lavender seedling. She looked up at me, her face smudged with dirt, and asked why I loved gardening so much. I thought for a moment, my hands deep in the rich, honest earth. I told her it was because everything good starts with honest soil and the right ingredients. Some things, I explained, can look beautiful on the outside, covered in bright flowers, but they're poison on the inside. The most important thing in the world is to learn how to know the difference. I handed her a small rosemary seedling. She took it and carefully placed it in the soil, her expression serious and focused. The cycle of deceit and poison was broken. And here, in the quiet sunlight, surrounded by new life, a new legacy, one of resilience and truth and wisdom, was finally taking root. In the end, Nora's story reminds us that a family, like any recipe, is defined by its ingredients. A life can be presented as a beautiful feast, but a single hidden ingredient of greed can turn the entire thing toxic. Daniel and Melissa thought their final ingredient would be a drop of poison in a teacup. They never considered the ingredients Nora held in reserve: a resilience forged in silence, a sharp and methodical mind, and a single earth-shattering truth. Her victory wasn't just in exposing a crime, but in proving that the last ingredient in any true legacy is never deceit. It is always the truth, the only soil in which a new, healthier life can truly grow.